Okay, so thank you. Thanks for having me part of this conference. It's an incredible lineup this year, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm Ksenya Samarskaya. I'm a creative practitioner here in Brooklyn and elsewhere. And I work under Samarskaya Partners, and all the works we do are collaborations on a range of visual communications, which I'll kind of do a quick slice gloss in the slides to come. I'm going to do a lightning round career overview because I haven't done that here before. And what I'm interested in focusing on is kind of the framework for my thinking, the questions that I've asked along the way in my career, and how those questions led from one place to the next. So initially, I'm going to back up a little and say what I studied and did early on was actually installation art. So it was exhibitions, gallery work, physical computing, and this gives me a slightly different take on the work that I did following. So to create this kind of work, you're kind of starting with nothing and you're building up entire worlds. And on occasion, I joke that my degrees were more or less in shopping and counterfeiting, because what you're doing is you're kind of looking at and assessing the world, understanding how to insert jokes and how to remix it to different ends or different contexts. So for example, in 2003, I was asking questions regarding what gets left after we're gone, like what the material evidence of our existence is, and this resulted in a series of 3 William Rhine installations, which included obstructed video, projections, basement, and entire bathroom that we kept rebuilding in different galleries, and an entity that we created to help tell our story, the Ministry of Observations. The Ministry of Observations was essentially a proto-Twitter and pondered what it would look like if instead of just tax and financial forms, if the government kept track of the idiosyncrasies that make up a unique life. This was 15 years ago, so I didn't quite imagine the dystopian tracking we'd have today. And another project from that year was the Registry of Existence, which took over a space in Michael Graves' Portland building, and referencing outdated psychological textbooks allowed people to prove or certify their personhood. My personal fascination with translation and misunderstandings first made its way into the gallery in 2005 in Translatech. Here, guests were invited to speak into a microphone. It'd go through a speech recognition and mistranslation computing program in the back, and it would give out a false but plausible enough receipt of the conversation. So it'd catch about 50% of what you were saying, and in a grammatically sound structure, make up the rest. And from that, I moved on into branding. Because the wide open thinking and agnostic attitude to medium, the focus on holistic communication translated perfectly to this next career. But shortly after working in branding, I noticed that all I was doing was either choosing fonts or manipulating them. And in order to be really good at what I was doing, I needed to understand them further. So I still kind of felt bound and limited by the typefaces and the emotional metadata that they carried with them, especially when it didn't perfectly fit the brand I was designing for or the page that I had in mind. So in my type and lettering work from the start, it's been about understanding what information I can pack into and what I can deduce from letterforms. There's been a lot of technical explorations. How do letters work for small sizes or newsprint, for broadcasts, for legibility, for dimensionality within extended reality? I took the concepts I learned with Tobias on working on Retina and Exchange and applied them to a screen type font diode, which is a 60s-inspired high-contrast serif that pairs and functions down to 4-point legibility on screen. For Sweet House, we drew an inline and a separate, not quite matching outline to be able to fit it to neon to be able to be seen at night, and then sign painting to be visible and legible during the day. For light and ladder's wordmark, we allowed it to rotate so it could sit nicely at the bottom of porcelain tableware. So in all of this, I was interested how type tells stories, how it turns, how people have drawn letters in so many different ways throughout history, and the breadth and range of what can do while still remaining crisp and modern and legible. So we've drawn type that reference World War plane posters, mid-century, mid-European book covers, delicate jewelry, tire tread, sea holly, backs of canvases, French cafes, or Russian vyaz. The most interesting projects have often been ones that ask us to combine seemingly irreconcilable concepts or elements. And the range of text, what it can do yet still be perfectly harmonious and legible, still seems boundless. Chapter 4. So for the internet, in addition to building standard, informative, and commerce websites, we'd often also ask how brand voice could be accentuated, how we can bring a tiny bit of magic or a bit of slow time to a medium that was more and more being directed towards a one-dimensional optimization. So we brought in rainbow prism shadows that responded to the tilt sensor on the phone or mouse movements on your screen. We created our own effects for a flipboard sign effect to respond to changing sensor data. And for our own page, S&P, I often talk about it dually as salt and pepper, because I believe that it's really all the flavor you need in a dish if you're cooking right. And that's kind of the metaphor that I see typography serving, that it can give all the flavor you need to a project if you're working with the right stuff and you're manipulating it. So for our site, we created kind of a sandbox effect that's if you're, spill some salt or pepper on your table and you're moving around and you're playing with it. So you can do that with your finger on a tablet or move around a mouse on a screen. We also built larger interactive applications, such as Where When, a social networks of happenings and events that lived for a couple years starting at the end of 2011. On the site, anyone could add or highlight events. You follow people, people follow you, and it'd tweet reminders at you and kind of let you know what was happening in the city. So the main challenges we're interested there was kind of rethinking how a calendar looked or functioned and moving it from a grid that I was used to seeing to kind of a more linear ticker tape receipt. And also thinking through a system, an event system that allowed for and celebrated ambiguity and privacy. And another site that we did is galvanized jets that comes out of the Pangram Fix Problems Quickly with galvanized jets. So what's a galvanized jet? We built it. So we kind of built this to help us build type and proof type as we go. It's for Latin, Greek, and Cyrillic, which are the type systems that I primarily work in. It's still up online, and the way it works is you drag a font from your browser, and each time you get a newly randomized set of words that pertain to certain constraints, like making sure that there's a pairing of every letter against every other letter, and allowing you to kind of quickly preview and see if there's any glitches or anything off in your type font. And if you're not a type designer but a logophile, it tends to generate a pretty spectacular and obscure reading word list. So these days, we spend a lot of time navigating multi-script typography with a primary focus on Cyrillic and Greek, as well as minority script research. In entering this terrain, again, I'm focusing on connotations that might come up, especially for people with different backgrounds. So I'm constantly working to stretch and update my knowledge of what's possible and hunting to find untraditional yet functional sources to reference outside of the canon. With our current sprawl of computing and digital type design, there's a certain colonial aspect that I see in it, where a type designer in Silicon Valley or on an island can create popular or inexpensive type, and all of a sudden, signs and communication across the globe, the handwritten and the design type that was there before gets swapped out by this new, easier, and cheaper system. And with that, the world kind of loses a lot of texture and a lot of history. And I think the way slang or linguistic subtlety carries through in language by region, the same things happen in type. Though often we're not sensitized enough for it, and it's not an angle we tend to consider and talk through. But in our designs, I tend to bring in questions of what's appropriate, but also what's underrepresented. And even within seemingly narrow bounding box of geometric sans serif faces, there are always options for proportions of movements that talk to different regimes or different regions. And finally, the last chapter has been my explorations in how I approach teaching. I'll talk a bit first. So I first came to enthusiastic experimental teaching at Harbor Space University, where I saw an institution that had its eyes open as to how the world was shifting in terms of both work and education, and was responding to it in a tactical way. It's been a space that's allowed me to test hypothesis in both mannerism and content for my courses. So the first thing when I came in, I wanted to remove the Eurocentric vision that's predominant when talking about typography. So I went through whatever examples of syllabi that I had from colleagues and elsewhere, and I blacked out everything I saw as potentially problematic, down to most terminologies such as sans serif and serif. And instead, I built the course based on looking, critiquing, and iterative experimentation. So this next set is type specimens that the students produced fresh to typography in their first week. And their assignment here was just kind of to pick a typeface, study it, explore it, write about it, and then design something that showed it in its best light or really worked with the information already there. So we got websites, we got animations and interactive designs. All the projects looked completely different. We got some 3D renderings. Juneza took Bauhaus and studied the architecture of the Bauhaus buildings and really worked the type into a form that worked with it. And I'm not sure if Pedro is here. He might be. He's not saying if he is, but you should find him and talk to him. Like, the craftsmanship of that is exquisite, and kind of the more you look at it, it's all built entirely out of Clarendon, and the more you look at it, kind of the more things you find. So the second thing that I noticed when I walked into the classroom was the students were enthusiastic, but the predominant question was, how do I avoid doing something wrong? And I was a little saddened because it wasn't, how do I make something truly remarkable? And this to me showed a fault in how we're talking about and how we're teaching our practice. Cyrus gave a talk on his way to accepting one of the biggest prizes in type design when we were out there, and in his talk he mentioned feeling like an imposter in this field. I've definitely felt like an imposter a lot of the time through not having properly studied it, but at the same time, that's exactly what attracted me to it. When I first entered type design, everyone was self-taught and no one had properly studied it, and it was such a beautiful combination of nerdiness and kind of rogue brazenness. So that's kind of one of the things I'm looking at, and the way that I was talking about it to my students is there's actually very little, and to people that are scared of type, there's actually very little that we're as intimately familiar with as typography. We've been interacting with it ever since we learned to read and write as children, from the first scribbles of our names as lettering to the first stacking of letter blocks as typography. And so in terms of where I'm at now, and my encouragement is that we learn from the evolving lessons of parallel fields and contemporary discourse, and that this field can be a lot more open and wide-reaching, and that it's useful to step back and consider a lot of the seeming basics that we take for granted. There's a certain image and a legacy of what the industry had been, but I'm more interested in what it can become and how we can help usher it there. Thank you.